Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson, and manage wateroperator.org. This is our free webinar series, the first one this year on groundwater and well care. If you participated before, we did this webinar last September, and so it's really the same material. I just want to point that out. We are working, we plan to start on a more advanced class, if you will. Working with Dick Meiliger, who's here today to help answer questions, municipal well and pump. But that won't be available until sometime towards the end of the year. So, but for today, we're going to learn about basics of groundwater and well care. So, there we go. So it's not pre-approved for CEU credit unless you've been informed of that by your state. We just don't have the bandwidth to work with every state to try to get CEU credit for this one class. What we can provide is the certificates at the end that you were on this webinar and participated, and also if you needed a copy of the slide deck as a PDF that you can use to turn into your certification body. And if they have any questions for us, you're welcome to give them our email address or anything like that. We have worked with most of the states. We do have an online class, what I'll talk about today, and that's approved in, I think, about 30 states for CEUs, self-paced. So this is being recorded, and it will be on our wateroperator.org YouTube channel. If you know someone else after this that you thinks might benefit from it, feel free to share it, let us know. And the last thing, don't have to worry about mowers today. I probably should have changed the slide. But we are at home today, and so my daughter may decide to interrupt, or had one problem last year with internet service. Hopefully that won't happen today, but just be aware that it's not as controlled of an environment. So, okay. Again, my name's Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the State Water Survey in Illinois. Jennifer Wilson's with us, our communications lead for wateroperator.org, and she's going to field your questions today. So if you have questions during the webinar, put them in either the question box or the chat box, whichever you may have on your GoToWebinar window. And you can ask questions there, and she's going to keep track of that during the webinar today, and we'll get to those at the end. And also I mentioned Dick Meiliger. He's Vice President of Municipal Well and Pump. He's our guest municipal well expert. That's an understatement. He has a lot of experience. It's who I go to for when I have questions about municipal wells, and he also does some training of his own, like for our Illinois Section 8 WWA, and he's been, again, like it says here, he's been a huge help in providing advice on a lot of issues related to municipal wells. I consider myself a private well expert, but there's certainly a lot of differences in private wells and municipal wells, and some of those things we're glad to have Dick involved. So a little bit about the water survey. I bring this up just for background. We were formed in 1895 at the U of I as a state agency. So we're a sister agency to our state geological survey. They're used to turning in drilling samples from when you may have a new well drilled for your community or anything like that. The geosurvey and the water survey here work hand in hand. We maintain all the well logs for the state, drinking water wells, and we work with our state EPA office on issues related to community wells in the state. So a little background here. For every community in the state, we have a set of records based on the wells they've drilled, or even if they have surface water intakes, and any help or pump tests we've done for them. We do a lot of Aquifer tests, are used to any of those things. Well, this is in the files for Pana, Illinois. From 1916, they had a typhoid outbreak, which is one of the reasons why the survey was formed, was issues like this. The town had a new water treatment plant they built in 1913, but they weren't using it because the mayor said it was too expensive to use. Only half the town was sewered, and so our guys went down there assuming they were going to find one of those two issues being the reason for the typhoid. There were 35 cases in less than a month, but in the end, it ended up being that 7 different dairy farmers brought their milk into the Pana Ice Cream Company. They stored it all in one large tank everyone used the same bucket to get milk out to take to their homes, and it had gotten contaminated, and that's where the source of the typhoid was. And so it's just an interesting story. It shows our background. You can go in our well records today and see this original document along with the stories that go with it and the investigation report and things like that. We also, our engineering section, what used to be our engineering section is now our groundwater section that I'm a part of. We do pump tests and aquifer tests for communities. We used to do a lot more of this than we do today, but this is an orifice bucket. If you're not familiar with it, it's got holes in the bottom and it's calibrated so you can measure the height of the water, and based on the height of the water in the bucket and the water running out, it's been calibrated in a lab to tell you what the flow rate is. And with that information, then, as you're doing your pump test, you can, if you're measuring observation wells for drawdown and all those things, you can get an idea of aquifer properties. And, we've done literally thousands of these tests over the last 60, 80 years. And we use an orifice bucket. In some cases, drillers actually borrow our orifice bucket sometimes. And other times we're using an orifice tube and a pipe for pumping a large volume of water. But it's one of the things that our section has been able to develop, and it's really molded who we are and what we do. I just showed this because, today well drilling rigs are fancy, and how the pipe fits together is all threaded, and most of it is. There's a lot of easy things to do, if you will. This is the U of I's well that was put in, I believe, around 1922, University of Illinois. And these are the spacers they're welding on by hand. And all of those rivets were put in by hand. And those are 10-foot sections of pipe, and they went to, I think, 180 feet. So that's a lot of work. And that's, the way a well needed to be put in back in the day. And so we've come a long way in a lot of those things, but it just shows, if your well's been in place, we certainly have community wells in Illinois that are close to 100 years old and still function. They were built right too. That's part of the reason. So I'm in the groundwater science collection section. We collect data from all around the state. I have a number of observation wells around the state that I manage, where we collect water level data frequently or with telemetry. We also collect water quality samples, so we understand the natural water quality aquifer. We do research too, as well as public service, like helping communities. Here doing a pump test, and that's an orifice too, measuring flow rate for a pump test with Chillicothe, Illinois. We do collect a lot of data. We house the state's well logs, both municipal and private wells. We have observation wells all over the state. This is an old Stevens recorder. Most of these have been replaced with more with pressure transducers and telemetry, so that we get readings in our office, even real time, things like that. But we also, in Illinois, the Illinois Water Use Act requires municipal water supplies, all water supplies, to report their water use to us annually. And we use that information. That data is really valuable when we get to the research side of things, which I'll talk about next, for groundwater modeling and predicting what's going to happen in the future, water supply planning, and some of those things. So we do, we've got well design capabilities. We do a lot of public outreach, and we also, we get requests for doing studies for areas like currently in Illinois. Joliet, Illinois is in the midst of a kind of a crisis because of the amount of water they pump out of the deep sandstone aquifer, and they're looking at alternative water supplies. And so we've done a lot of the work working with their consultants to model how much time they have before they're going to start having problems by dewatering the deep aquifer and some of those issues. And so all the data we've collected, and we have information for Joliet going back almost 100 years as well, really helps us evaluate that kind of situation and how water levels used to be, 50 years ago in the Chicago area versus today, where the population's increased at least twofold, if not more. And so I mentioned research. Groundwater modeling is probably the big thing our section does, but we also look at well interference issues and contamination. And we've been working with DNR over the last 6 or 8 years on regional groundwater supply planning to evaluate long-term what's expected to happen with growth, what kind of resources available in different parts of the state, both groundwater and surface water, and just to understand how changes in water chemistry are affecting areas like salt is really affecting the shallow groundwater in the Chicago area as it becomes more urban. We're seeing some communities where their chlorides are going up in their natural groundwater. So we're going to go through a little geology lesson first. As part of this, it's really about understanding groundwater and the type of well you have. So you either have a bedrock well or you have a sand and gravel well. And the difference is that a bedrock well is getting water from the fractures in the rock, where a sand and gravel well is getting water that exists in the sand and gravel all through the pores. And that's, here's the pore space. This is a typical block of sand and gravel, and the water can run freely through the sand grains or gravel, and you use a well screen to keep the sand out and let the water in. But the pore space here is really critical because it's in a well-sorted sand, it can be as much as 30%. And that porosity, and if it's full of water, an aquifer, say in an alluvial or near a river, it's mostly full of water, is a huge resource. And you see a lot of irrigation wells that are pumping thousands of gallons a minute in those areas where it's sandy soil and it's close to a river or in a bottom ground. And that's because there's so much water held in that sand and gravel. And the other side of that is bedrock. It's a fractured system. Sandstone can hold water in it, but most rock, granite, limestone, dolomite, I guess dolomite is limestone, water's running through the fractures. So it's really more like pipe flow. And the only water you have depends on how many fractures there are and how interconnected they are. So you can have two bedrock wells within a half mile of each other in the same aquifer. One can pump several thousand gallons a minute because it's connected to a bunch of fractures and they're all connected. And the other one could pump less than 50 gallons a minute. And that's a real case. Working with some irrigators up in Kankakee County in Illinois. One of the gentlemen who's a potato farmer has a well he calls his Cadillac well because it costs as much as a Cadillac to drill, and he only gets 40 or 50 gallons a minute, where he was hoping to get 1,200 or 1,400 gallons a minute. And it's all about whether you hit those fractures or not. And so there's other differences with that too, which I'll explain in a little bit. Related to, so you have, these are the types of aquifer material. The top three are all unconsolidated. That means it's not bedrock. So you may be in an area where there's alluvial sand from a river, where the river may use, the old days like the Mississippi, before all the glaciers came through and everything else, the Mississippi was 12 to 15 miles wide, and now it's less than a mile wide, at least in Illinois. But the bottom ground, where it's all sandy soil, which used to be sandbars, all that stuff, is still that 12-mile wide area. And so it's usually filled with sand, sometimes some silts and clays too, on which side of the river you're on. But it's these sorted materials that are unconsolidated that can hold a lot of water. And the other side of that are fractured rock, bedrock, which is consolidated aquifer material on the bottom here. And it's just showing three different examples. Just, that's what a block of rock would look like. It's got fractures in it. Granite in the middle has smaller fractures. So, there's areas out west, especially like in the Rockies, I guess out east as well, in mountainous areas where if your well's in granite, it may be really deep and you still may only get a little bit of water out of it, because typically granite has much less fracturing, and it's got an overall porosity of just a few percent versus the 30 you see in sand and gravel. And then, limestone, dolomitic limestone or karst, we have that in southern Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, a lot of areas where you see caves and springs. Those are also those dissolution channels, if you will, where the water has eroded the rock away. You have large storage of water. And so if your well is in that type of cavern, you can have almost unlimited water, just like you would in a large sand and gravel. The problem with that, though, is you also have connections to the surface, and a lot of times the water quality is a little poor, especially in karst areas. So the other issue besides the other factor besides porosity that's important is permeability. And permeability is like a velocity. It's not quite the same, but that's a fair way to think of it. It's about how fast water can move through the material. And water flows downhill, right? If I pour water on a table and lift one end up, it runs down to the other end. And so you have to have pressure in the system where there's an imbalance. So there's higher pressure in one spot, causing the water to flow towards the lower pressure, because that's how water moves. And so permeability takes that into account too. But when you have larger grains in unconsolidated material like gravel and sand, it can move, as you can see here, as much as 3,000 feet in a day, depending on the pressure in the system. I mean, if it's completely flat, the pressure is the same everywhere, the water is just going to sit. But if it's coming from an area of higher pressure, which is typically where you have recharge, to lower pressure, where typically you have discharge, like at a river or stream, water is going to be moving through that system sort of based on the difference in pressure from one end to the other. But you also have then lower permeable units like silts and clays. So a silt and a clay can have a porosity of well over 20%, just like sand does. The problem is that the grains are so small that water can't flow through as easily. And so that's why, like for a clay, it's considered an aquitard, not an aquifer, because it prevents water from flowing through it. And it doesn't allow water to move freely. And so that's why when you have a clay on top of an aquifer, most of the time it's considered an aquitard or an aquiclude. On the bedrock side, most of these things, again, as I mentioned, the permeability is based on the fractures. I need to give me 1 second here. I apologize. I had a daughter issue there. So the fractures in limestone, it really depends on how many fractures, how interconnected they are. So it can be even more than 3 feet a day, depending on if you pump in a well and you're creating a pressure difference, it's going to flow through those fractures, like I mentioned, almost like pipe flow, based on the pressure in a pipe, right? Sandstone does have some secondary permeability in the sand grains, but it's really cemented sand, and so it's a good aquifer because you're not just getting water from the fractures. There could be some storage as well that you wouldn't have in other types of rock. And then we get to shale, which is basically cemented consolidated clay. And that's why you see it could be as little as 1 foot in 100,000 years. So water really doesn't move through it nearly as well, if at all. And we've certainly even seen clay and unconsolidated material that's so tight, if you will, like the 1 foot per 10,000 years, that it fooled our geologists and he thought it was shale. And so when you reach into those units, they completely separate water flow from the surface and between aquifers, and they really play a big role in keeping pressure on the system. Water can't just flow up out of an aquifer into another unit if it's a shale layer there that's keeping, it just doesn't let the water through. Again, sorry about that. Over here, this page, there we go. So this is just a conceptual model of the differences. What I always use as an example here is, let's say these were horse tanks and you're looking at them from the side. If you have a thing full of sand and you pour water on the top, it's going to run through that sand with the wetting front until the whole thing's saturated or hits the bottom. Whereas if you have dolomite, it's more, you can see it's more like laid brick in a way. There's layers and layers and layers upon each other, and so fractures between those that let the water through, versus on the lower left, crystalline bedrock is granite, is one type of crystalline bedrock. And the fractures are small, they're typically not as connected. And we see, especially with private wells that are on a mountainside somewhere, where they're maybe only able to pump a 600-foot deep well at a 1/4 gallon a minute. And that's where my experience with that is. But then those are all simplified, as the one on the bottom right is, but it's really mixed. Bedrock's not flat, for one thing. It's usually at an angle. It can be a lot of different units, not just this is showing sandstone and dolomite and what happens whenever there's pressure above pushing water through the system. So you need to understand the geology for your well, and your geology could be different than even your neighbor in town. We see a lot of differences, how thick the aquifer is, what the head is, how much water pressure do you actually have. You know, a good example here in Illinois, there's an aquifer that runs from the Indiana state line in central Illinois over to the Illinois River, which is about 2/3 of the state width-wise, and it's about 180 miles between the two, but two ends, if you will. And on the east end, it's buried under two sets of glaciation, and it's under pressure. And and so it doesn't get much recharge because of that. And so we could really deplete the eastern part of this Muhammad Aquifer. But on the west end, where the Illinois River is, it's now the sand that is the aquifer is at the surface. So it gets 12 inches of recharge versus a 1/4 inch, 180 miles east of it. It's the same aquifer, but you're not going to move water 180 miles uphill, if you will, because the water level in the east end of the aquifer is like 780. That's the elevation of the water level. And at the Illinois River, it's 440. So there's 300 feet of head difference between that 180 miles that are pushing water towards the river at the discharge point. And it's because we have a few little recharge areas over here that the water levels are so high. But it really affects everything. And, you know, on the west end, they have 2,300 irrigation pivots pumping as much as nearly 1 billion gallons a day in a dry year, and it doesn't affect the aquifer that much. And over on the east end, you have 40 or 50 feet of drawdown, which is a lot for this aquifer with much less pumpage. So you really need to understand your situation and where you're at, and that's the whole point of all this. So here's a schematic this is Iowa Department of Natural Resources, a handbook on groundwater basics. And it shows you, where we're at, and this is very typical for Illinois at least, where you have at the top, you have glacial drift, which is usually silt and clay with some sand mixed in. Then there's some actual sand units, which are these wells, those two shallow wells are in. And that's one is alluvial, that's the one where the river is. You're looking at a cross section, and that's the bigger semicircle there. You can see where the river is today is just a small little piece of where the river used to flow, like when the glaciers melted and it dug into that glacial drift. But then there's a deep well that's down into sandstone. It goes through a shale unit, and there's a shale unit below it. And because it's under pressure, and it really isn't, these are all shown as flat lines straight across, but somewhere in that aquifer, the water levels are higher. And we know that because the water level in that well comes well up into the shale. So that's an artesian aquifer, it's under pressure, and the water level comes up above the top of the sandstone and limestone, which together make that aquifer. And so it's just a conceptual model to kind of help everyone understand it really matters where you're at. And not every well is, if you have a shallow water table, it doesn't reflect necessarily what the water level would be in an aquifer further below. And this shows that at the top. In Illinois, our water table, a lot of the state is less than 15 feet. Some places much shallower. And that can be also the top of the aquifer in some cases if it's an unconsolidated and it's water table aquifer. But if it's buried and it's under its own pressure, it could be much different. And this is just showing how water moves. The hydrologic cycle, we're all used to it rains, it falls on the ground, it runs into a river or a lake, it evaporates, or it runs to the ocean, then evaporates, and it starts all over again. Well, that totally leaves out the groundwater portion of this. You do have discharge from groundwater to rivers and lakes and even the ocean in some places. But groundwater, a lot of it infiltrates. And where does that water go? Well, it really depends on what the material is in the ground, what the geology is, whether it's going to go make it through an aquitard, whether it's going to become part of the base flow of a stream. We see our large rivers even during drought, where the water level doesn't change that much in the river, even though there hasn't been rain maybe it's an 18-month drought. That's because groundwater is still discharging and keeping a certain amount of water flowing in those streams or rivers. And so The time difference in how quickly the water actually makes it back to the surface can vary from days to, as it shows here, the bottom one, this very lower unit, millennia before the, we can date water using age dating techniques and see that some water is, tens of thousands of years old in the ground in some of the deeper aquifers. So it's a complicated cycle, but it's, again, depending on where your well is or where your well field is on this landscape and what the geology is. You may have water that's much more frequently recharged, so you have more water available, or it could be that a lot of large users came to the area and started pumping from the same aquifer that your wells are in. You could have some issues. So aquifer availability, the geology really determines what well type you're going to have. If you have a good sand and gravel aquifer, you may put a well in sand and gravel, and that's a sand and gravel well. If you don't, or the water quality isn't sufficient, or it's a very shallow sand and gravel and it's susceptible to surface contamination, you may drill deeper. And that could vary from, bedrock exists from the surface. In some places it's, 800 feet below unconsolidated sand, gravel, and clay, or sand, silt, and clay. So it really depends. In Illinois, it varies widely. The Muhammad Aquifer that I mentioned earlier is a sand and gravel aquifer. It's at the surface in Mason County along the Illinois River. It's buried under unconsolidated glacial material to about 200 feet on the east side, which is where we're at the University of Illinois in Champaign, near the Indiana state line. Bedrock, the same way. You can have a shallower bedrock. You may only have to drill a well 80 to 150 feet in Illinois to get good water, or even less. In the Chicago area, there's a lot of wells that are nearly 2,000 feet deep, because the deep sandstone there is especially for municipal supplies, is kind of the aquifer of choice. But then you still have other issues. I'm not going to talk much about it today, but when you get into the deep wells, you have other kinds of constituents. You can have arsenic, radium, some of those things. But you need to understand the difference and what kind of well you have and how deep it is and how protected it is at the surface. I'm going to show dug wells, even though there aren't really municipal dug wells, just because I'm assuming we have at least some small systems on our webinar today. And what I find is a lot of the smaller systems get questions from well owners that are in their nearby area. Dug wells are usually put in place when there is no real aquifer, unless they're really old. And it's because, back in the 20s or 30s, drill rigs weren't as prevalent and drillers weren't as prevalent, and you dug your own well if you had a farm especially, and that's what this well in the upper left is. It's an old well that's on a hillside, but you can see how unprotected and unsafe this is. This is actually in a cattle pasture, and the reason those posts are so wore down is because they're scratching posts for the cows. So you can imagine, and not only it doesn't have any kind of a seal on it. So when you get questions from well owners, you should be able to talk about what's going on, what kind of well they have, what's safe and not safe, because they rely on you as a water operator to be the expert. And so that's another reason to be informed. We also have a lot of times folks who are private well owners who don't even understand where their water's coming from. I've probably had, literally in the last 6 years, probably 8 to 10 different water operators I've talked to who said they had someone come call their office and complain about not having water, only for them to have to explain to them that they're not on the city's water supply or the community water supply, that they must have their own well. And in one case, a guy told me he went out to their house because they had water lines on one side of the road, but they were on the other side, and the well was sitting in their front yard. And these people didn't have water one day, and they called and complained. And so it's really an issue that if you're able to help, your nearby neighbors, if you will, understand that if they have a dug well, an old dug well or a bored well that's very shallow, that they're more at risk for surface contamination. And actually all three of these are bored wells, or are dug wells. And the only difference, they're large diameter wells. So and that's because there's no real aquifer. So you put in a well that's 3 or 4 foot diameter. We've seen them as big as 20 foot diameter, so that they can store water, just like a cistern would. or a storage tank if you have to haul water. Some people get water from town and haul it and put it in a large tank at their house because they have no water available. So it's just good to know those things. And here's two diagrams that show the bottom two pictures there. The one on the right, where it's just got a regular well cap at the top, it's because the actual large part of the well doesn't start until under more than 10 feet. And in Illinois, that's the law now. You have to use, you can't start the large diameter part of the well at the surface. It's got to have a regular well cap. Usually it's a 6-inch casing with a pitless, usually because we have cold weather here. And then, the large part of the well, the 3-foot diameter, is down below, and water's seeping in slowly. And so, and I know I grew up on a dug well, and if in the summer, if we had livestock, if I left the hose in the horse tank and forgot about it, we might not have water for 3 days until water can slowly seep back in our well and fill it up. And so you have that large area inside the well, so that even if you draw it down to take a shower or doing laundry or whatever, over time and during the night, it can refill. And there's little sand lenses a lot of times in glacial material, which is where you see these a lot. But it's good to understand what they are. So you either have a sand and gravel well as a community water supply or a bedrock well. The difference is, as I mentioned, sand and gravel well uses a screen. This is I think this is a 10-slot screen, and it lets the water in and keeps the sand out. You also put a gravel pack around this. It's a certain size, so it helps filter the finer sand so you're not pumping sand. This steel casing, the steel screen may have, for a private well, might have PVC. Likely for a community well, it's steel. And it just depends on, where a private well may have a 4-foot screen, you with a community well may have a 20-foot screen or even larger if the aquifer is that thick and there's that much water available. It makes it a lot easier for water to get in, and using the screen size is how tight that's wound is based on the sand that's pulled up when the driller's drilling the well and the cuttings, so they understand what kind of sand they're dealing with. If it's large gravel, you can have bigger holes, right? And so, the thing about a sand and gravel well is if you have a 200-foot sand and gravel well, water's only coming in at the screen. So if you have a 10 or 20-foot screen that's at the bottom, then water can only get in the well from 180 or 190 to 200 feet below land surface. The rest of the casing is solid. And so, and that's one of the things that's different. First, here's a typical well log in Illinois. It shows a lot of information. You should have the well logs for your community water supply. We run into cases every once in a while. One of the areas I was working in Illinois, they'd had a fire and lost their logs. It's before they were maintained by the state. So there's a community where we do not have their well logs. They just don't exist. But you should, if you don't, talk to your contractor, your engineering firm, or your driller and get a copy. The state should have those on file. Most states require those to be filed. But it's a lot of information. The geology, number 18 here, tells you the formations you pass through and how thick they are. And that's a lot of good information to understand, where your well's at. You've got, and this is a private well, so it's got an 8-foot length slotted screen, number 14 there. But it shows all the materials, where it's at, location, who the owner is, all those things that are required, as well as it's a pump date. Usually there's a pump test information, how much the water drew down during the test and stuff like that. So a bedrock well, on the other hand, they can be cased and then have slots cut in the steel. But most of the time, you seat the casing once you hit bedrock, 10 or 20 feet into the bedrock, which is what this diagram is showing. And after that, it's an open hole. And so you keep drilling through the rock. You've drilled a deep hole, but you only put casing down 10 or 20 feet into the rock. And the rest of it is just the rock itself acts like the casing. And you do that so you can hit the fractures and get water from the fractures. If you case it off, like if you look at this picture, right above the 10 to 20 foot line where the casing stops, there's a fracture running through there, that water can't get in the well because there's casing in the way. But the fracture is near the bottom, that's an open hole, and so they're all connected. And that's the game whenever you're drilling a bedrock well, is you need to hit enough fractures, and they need to be interconnected enough that you have enough water for a community water supply. That's typically several hundred gallons a minute or more, depending on the size of your community or how many wells you have. So the other side of that is it can also be influenced from a larger distance. If your water's coming from only 1 or 2 fractures, then that water's got to move those fractures from more of a distance to maintain the same amount of water flow as if you had a lot of fractures and a lot of interconnected fractures. And so it's good to know, especially because those fractures can run back up to the surface. And so the influence area of your well could be more with a bedrock well. And here's a typical bedrock well. This is actually a non-community system. It's Camp Algonquin in Algonquin, Illinois, up in the Chicago area, one of the Collier counties. And the interesting thing here, you can see if you look at the log in number 18, they ran through some sand. A lot of times the drillers will put the color there. If it's brown, it means it's usually susceptible to air. If it's gray, it means it's usually always wet. And that's an indicator of how much water might be available in a shallower unit. But they hit limestone at 189, 187, and then broken limestone, that's typical, the top of the rock, because at one point it may have been actually the land surface before glaciation. And so it's soft and it's broken up, but once you get into the regular limestone, there's 68 feet of it down to 257. So what's interesting here is number 15, the casing. They use black steel from 179 to 199. And that's because they're seeding that part of the casing in the bedrock. So they hit limestone, the solid limestone at 189. They went 10 feet into it to put the casing and seed it in the limestone so it's solid. But above that 20-foot section of steel pipe, they use PVC because it doesn't have the same stress on it that part seated in the rock would have. And below 199, there's no casing, so it's just an open hole. And when they hit shale, they stop. You're not going to get water out of shale, at least not a usable quantity for a municipal well. And then, right above that, the static level was 130, which means it's artesian because the top of the limestone was 189 or 187. And when they pumped it at 25 gallons a minute for 2 hours, it dropped to 160. So there's some indication of how much water is available. For a municipal well, most of the time you're going to do a pump test as well and have better information than just a short test. And you should have all that information. So it's just a good example of how a lot of these wells are typically constructed. I'm going to show you, these are examples from Illinois. That's the best ones that I have. And so that the sand and gravel aquifers are shown here, the major ones. These are river valleys, right? Before glaciation in Illinois, which happened about 1 million years ago, these blue areas were where water cut into the bedrock, and the large area across the center of the state was called the Mahomet-Taze River, and it went all the way back to West Virginia, and it ran into the Mississippi, which is the other area here. Mississippi actually didn't flow where it does today around the outside boundary of the state of Illinois on the west side. It actually turned up in the northwest part there where the two thick areas are and came down through what's now the Illinois River. Used to be the Mississippi. And then a glacier came along and moved it. And so but these large areas, once they were covered by glaciation and the glacial meltwaters, they filled up with sand and gravel and boulders. And they're major aquifers today because we've had 3 glaciations in the north half of Illinois that filled that up when they melted. A lot of fast-moving water. We drilled a well in the Mahomet over close to where it runs into the Illinois River, and we couldn't even keep the well open. The driller felt the boulders at the bottom of that part of the unit were as large as cars. And so, some fast-moving water to move stuff like that into one area. As I said, this was the ancient Mississippi, and this now, all of this ancestral Mississippi, and the creeks that used to run through there now are buried, and they're great sources of water. A lot of irrigation in this area, in the sandy part of this area in Bureau and Henry and further south. And this was the flow of the ancient Mississippi until the glaciers came along. And now it's filled with a lot of sand and other material because of that. And so this is the aquifer in that area. And again, it's very extensive. So there's a lot of good water sources in these communities. And you don't have to go very far, or well, yeah, very far to get a lot of water. In the Green River, you see on the lower left side there, there's an area up there called the Green River Lowlands, which is all sandy up to the surface. And it's a huge irrigation area in the state. And you can see this here. It's funny because the same Cody aquifer shown here on the bottom is flowing towards the Mississippi, but there's a moraine, which is when the glacier stops and it deposits all the material that it's ground up, coming from Canada or wherever. And so this glacial moraine is the large mountains, if you will, or hill on the right. And then you have the Tampico aquifer, which is also sand and gravel that was caused by the ancient Mississippi because it used to be that wide. And so there's sand at the top. There's still some clay and lake clay from before the glaciers came or when they came and moved the Mississippi. It also then formed dams and lakes formed, which lake clay, if you've ever stepped into a pond or a lake that's full of that muck in the bottom, it's lacustrine clay. It's very fine, and it acts as a barrier. And so we see water, we see irrigators now drilling through the clay down into the St. Cody and then putting the water up in the Tampico. So it's an interesting area in that respect. This is actually a figure from a cover of a document from the Muhammad Aquifer that I worked on. We went out and put in 40 monitoring wells and did a study for Bloomington Normal to determine how much water could be pulled out of the Muhammad in an area west of Bloomington Normal, Illinois. And it just turns out the geology is really complicated. So there's been 3 glaciations, which the Muhammad's at the bottom, but even though you'd think that'd all be sand, we ran into silts and clays that weren't moved by the glaciers. The little squiggly lines or soil layers where after one glacier ended, plants, animals, life took form for maybe several 100,000 years, and then another glacier came along and buried it all. And so the black areas are peat and organic matter, and we've had, as I said, 3 sets of glaciers that have come through and made the complicated geology that we have. And so, it depends on where you're at, which unit you can put a well in. We see a lot of private wells in these shallower units that are smaller, but the Muhammad is actually really extensive and runs across 11 counties. As I mentioned, about 180 miles. In some places, it's as much as 15 to 20 miles wide. And so it's a huge resource for water supply. We also have bedrock in Illinois. Bedrock aquifers, there's bedrock everywhere. Eventually, or in areas where you don't have sand and gravel aquifers, you may have bedrock at the surface, especially in the south or unglaciated areas. But the shallow bedrock here, this is the only places in Illinois where the shallow bedrock is considered a water supply. And we've mapped this from well logs and all that information. And so we have a good idea where a community can get more water. We have a lot of communities, especially really small ones, where they maybe only have one well, which our advice is you should never just have one. You should have a backup in case something happens. But in those cases, you need to know if there's other water nearby. And then there's also the deep aquifer I mentioned. It's used in the north part of the state. It's a deep sandstone. It's really interesting because it actually exists over the entire state. But in the area that's all white, the chlorides are so high, it's not considered a water supply. And it's because it's an ancient ocean where the water is still very salty, has a TDS in some cases near 10,000. And because of all the pumpage in the Chicago area, we're seeing that line start to move slowly north. And so it may be several hundred years, it may be a lot longer if there's steps taken, but eventually some of the communities that use this deep aquifer may not be able to because it may start to get more salty. Or they'll have to treat, which treating salt water is an expensive proposition. So here's an example for the Chicago area. As I mentioned, geology isn't flat, right? It's a, there's these are the units. The Ironton, Galesville, and the St. Peter sandstone are two of the deeper units. And near Chicago, you can see they're more than 1,000 feet below land surface. But to the west, which DeKalb is only maybe 50 or 70 miles. I should have looked that up, and I don't remember exactly, but it's not that far. It's just off the collar counties of the Metroplex of Chicago. It's much shallower, right? It's only 200 feet of elevation, or it's actually at an elevation. Yeah, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. These are elevation lines. So the elevation in the area is around 500 feet in the Chicago area, the mean sea level, and the aquifer is down at 1,000 below. So that's 1,500 feet, which is what I said before. And as you move west, it actually outcrops near Rockford, which is another 40 or 50 miles further west than this. And so because the geology is not flat, those layers were laid down at an angle, the area far west of Chicago acts as a recharge area for these two aquifers. The red line is showing the actual water levels in wells that are in the Ironton, Galesville here. And so you can see that should be a pretty consistent line, and it's not because of pumpage. But in the Chicago area itself, they don't pump as much out of the deep aquifer as they used to. And so you've seen some water levels recover there. And so even though it's not intuitive, water is flowing both directions towards the middle, which is what those arrows show. Because these wells are open to both of these units. And so the water level is kind of a combined water level between the St. Pete and the Ironton, Galesville. And you can see what the lowest water level is at Elmhurst, and water's flowing towards that in both directions. And so it's kind of flowing, if you will, uphill further east of that from Chicago. And that's because water doesn't move based on what direction it's going, it moves based on pressure. And the lowest pressure is at Elmhurst in this diagram. And so the point here, I guess, is to understand where your water comes from, you need to have other information about water levels from nearby towns, or talk to your state resource agency. They probably have all this information already, like we do. And here's a simplified diagram. I just want to show this because it's the same kind of situation here. The recharge for the artesian aquifer, and those solid lines that separate each one are supposed to be simplified tops and bottoms of each aquifer. So there's a lower confining bed at the bottom above the bedrock, then there's artesian aquifer, then an upper confining bed, which would be like shale or clay, and then a water table aquifer, and then that solid line is the water table, which they should have done a better job and used a different type of line there. But the water level in the deep aquifer, the artesian aquifer, is the dashed line. So you see the well that says artesian that's on the right, the water level's still in the well, but it's well above the top of the aquifer. And so it's considered artesian because it's under pressure. Only when you have a well where, the reason this dashed line drops to the top of the well where the water's coming out is because you basically poked a straw in it and letting water out at a lower pressure. Water level would be flat across the top. That dashed line would be if you put more casing in that well on the left up to above where the dashed line is. That's where the water level would be. And so a lot of times when you see artesian wells, it's because they're low on the landscape and there's a recharge area somewhere far away that's keeping the water levels elevated in those wells. Okay, so an aquifer, there's a lot of definitions that people use for an aquifer. And what would be an aquifer for a community water supply is certainly an aquifer for a private well. But what's considered an aquitard for a community water supply that may need several hundred gallons a minute may be perfectly fine, or be the only option for a private well, which may only need 5 gallons a minute. So it's really the saturated bed. It's a geologic formation that yields water a sufficient quantity to be a source of supply, and that's your definition based on how much supply you need. Because one man's, as I mentioned, one man's aquitard could be another man's aquifer. Where an aquitard means it won't produce that much water, and it doesn't have enough leakage, and it doesn't, water can't get into that aquifer, that material quick enough to sustain a certain quantity of water. And an aquiclude is the definition of something that's, like we're talking about shale, where it basically doesn't allow water to move through it, or it's so low you won't see it. You can't really tell. Okay, so it's, again, different users or uses will define what an aquifer is or isn't, and that's just here nor there. You can let all the geologists argue that one. An unconfined aquifer means it's at the water table, so it's got a free surface. So if you're along a river and there's 100 feet of sand there, and the water level is only 6 feet, and all of the sand is saturated below that, that's considered a water table aquifer because it's got a free surface in the unit, in the geologic unit. So at 6 feet down, it becomes saturated. That's the water table, and it's also an unconfined aquifer. Where a confined aquifer, like we've shown before, is usually has an aquitard or some aquiclude above it, and whenever you put a well into that aquifer, the water level rises above the top. And once the water, like if you pump a confined aquifer that's artesian enough to lower the water level in the well below the top of the aquifer, then that aquifer converts to water table because now it has a free surface, right? It's not all saturated anymore. So here's an example. Here's the water table with an unconfined aquifer, and once you get to the saturated zone, there's just one unit. This is, let's say, all sand until bedrock. And so there's an amount of water that's just stored in that unit. If you have a confining layer, though, now you have two different water levels. One's called the potentiometric surface. That's because it's a pressure description, where the unsaturated area is above the water table, and you have saturated water. That's still a water table aquifer for the shallow well. The deeper well is below that aquitard, and the water level rises in the well above the confined unit, up somewhere into what we consider the aquitard there. You do still have water moving slowly through the aquitard down into the confined aquifer, and that's occurring because the pressure in the water table aquifer is higher than the pressure in the confined aquifer, and that pressure is defined by the water level in each. So because the water level is higher in the unconfined aquifer, water is slowly migrating down through that aquitard and provides a little but not much water into the confined unit. And if they were the same, then one, we consider that they must be connected somewhere, but it also means that water is not moving through the aquitard at all because the pressure is the same on both sides. And if it was reversed, then water would be flowing up through the confining layer into the unconfined aquifer. And we see all those cases. So here's water level in a well is above the top of the aquifer. The dashed lines represent, an aquiclude or aquitard that prevents water from going through. And then you have a water table that's above in that shallower unit. I'm not sure what I was trying to show here. I guess here is the opposite situation where the water level in the aquifer is higher than the water table. So water is going to migrate up instead of down, like I just mentioned. And then you can have a flowing artesian well if there's enough pressure on the aquifer that it's actually pushing water up out of the well. And that only occurs because somewhere else off to the left or right, the water level in that aquifer and the aquifer itself is probably at a higher elevation. And so it's pushing water. It's no different, honestly, than if you put a straw in a juice box and you squeeze it. You're putting pressure on the system. So where does it come out? It comes out the straw. I mean, it's the same thing. Somewhere off to the left or right of this diagram, there's more pressure in the aquifer, and it's causing the water level to rise in that well. I'm going to skip this, but it's basically just to reinforce what we talked about before. And so the other thing is when you pump a well, so what you're looking at here is the top picture is if you slice through the side of the well and you're looking at the geology, land surface is up where the arrow is, and this is down to the bedrock is this dashed line at the bottom. So you have a screen, it shows there, and you're pumping that well, and what it does is it causes drawdown. So you're seeing the dashed line where it says water table is the static water level when it's not pumping. And when you start pumping the well, it starts drawing water down, and the lowest elevation is going to be at the well. because water's seeping in from all around, trying to get in that, trying to be flat again, right? It wants to be flat. Water wants to sit, if you have water in a bathtub, it's flat. It's because of pressure. You don't have it mounted on one end. Same thing here. So water's running towards the well, trying to fill in where the pressure's lower. And on the bottom picture, that's the pumping well. You're looking at it's like if you're up in a helicopter looking down. And those numbers, the 410 to 460 and 400 is the water level, mean sea elevation of the water in the well. So it's lowest in the well and it's concentric circles. And this is ideal if the sand and gravel around this in this diagram were perfectly shaped, the perfect size, all the same size, so that water moved exactly the same from all areas. You'd have this idealized perfect concentric circles, which isn't reality, but it demonstrates what's going on. So when you pump a well, you see drawdown. How far that drawdown occurs is the cone of influence, because it's creating a cone, right? And then just the drawdown itself tells you how much, how deep or how much that'll change based on how much you pump. If I'm pumping 500 gallons a minute here and it draws it down 60 feet, if I pump 250, it would be less than that. You wouldn't see as much, because what ends up happening is this reaches an equilibrium and you're taking out as much water as can get in the well, and it will reach a steady state or a static drawdown where it won't go down anymore. And that's what a step test is. You run it at different rates and you see how that changes, so you can determine the specific capacity of your well. Another example, if you have a well field, these two wells can influence each other. A lot of times when you design a well field, you're trying to minimize the impact one has on the other. You may not plan to pump them both, or you may have, a lot of times you want to be redundant, right? So maybe you have 4 wells, you pump 2 at the same time, but they will influence each other, and how much they influence each other depends on the properties, how much you're pumping. And again, this is what the drawdown would look like anywhere in that area around those wells, because of pumping both at the same time. So it obviously impacts both. And you see more drawdown in the middle between them. It's a much flatter, almost the same amount, because that part of the aquifer can't provide water to both sides. So there's not as much water to go back in the well, into both wells in between them, as there is from the outside areas. That makes sense. And then you also have, you're not necessarily in the middle of the aquifer. You're on an edge, and it's going back to the Muhammad example, that picture on top where it says edge of aquifer, that's where the old river valley stopped when it cut into the bedrock. And that's just the shape it looks like. So if you're close to an edge, you have less water available on the left side than you do on the right side. And so you're going to see more drawdown, because there's just not as much water to fill that back in like there is on the left. And so that's why the picture on the bottom makes the drawdown look skewed, because you're getting more drawdown on the edge of the aquifer side. And you can also have the opposite situation if you're near a river, right? The river, if it's connected to the aquifer, like in this case it is, it's a direct source. So the more you pump, you're actually going to be taking water out of the river. And that's why some water, if you're close to a river, that's your only choice for water supply, it may be considered groundwater under the influence. And you have to treat it like it's surface water, because you're actually pulling surface water in as you pump. And because the river is at a constant elevation, in this case it says 445, you can see on the bottom picture that it has no effect on water levels on the other side, where water's going into the river. And again, if you look at the picture of the river on the top, see how the dashed lines kind of slope down towards the river? That's because there's always water recharging the aquifer, from the aquifer running into the river, because there's higher water levels further away from it. The rivers are usually in the lowest spot, right? So as the land surface rises away from a river, usually the water levels rise, and so water is the part of the natural system. And when rainfall infiltrates into the ground and gets to the aquifer, it's going to raise the water level, and it's going to run towards its discharge point, which is in this case this river. But it makes it a great water supply if you have alluvial sands near you. And we also see, there's communities where they're in an area where there really is no aquifer, and they can either build a lake, which is really hard to do these days especially, or they can run a pipe to the nearest large river system. And we see areas where they ran water 10, 12 miles to help a community, to provide water for a community, because that's their best water source and closest. So other things that we do and what we have done in the past is we look at use to yield, which means how much water is being pumped versus what we know about all the aquifer properties and how much water can theoretically be pumped without causing the water levels to drop and not recover. So this shows the shallow and the deep bedrock aquifers, I believe is what this is. So you can see on the left are the shallow aquifers that I showed first on those 3 blue maps. They're not being utilized. The tan is where, I'm sorry? Okay, sorry. I'm getting feedback. I apologize. So on the tan is where the aquifer actually exists, and you can tell by the colors there that the shallow bedrock isn't being utilized in a lot of areas. And this is by township. We've looked at use by township based on large capacity or high capacity wells, which in Illinois, every high capacity well has to be registered and provide their water use to us. So we understand the information, we have it. And then the deep aquifer, which is one we talked about. Somebody is not muted, and they should be. If you don't mind making sure you're muted. Thank you. So for the deep aquifer in the Chicago area, you can see how we're greater than 90% of use. And this is actually from, I believe, from like 2003. So it's worse today, or in some areas it is. And, you know, it's a good way to look at the situation and what's going on and understand that, you know, we're overusing groundwater resources in that area, which now has come to a head. And we're seeing some communities that they're having to change where they get their water from. And so it's causing a dilemma, and that's because the population up there keeps growing. So it's just, there's a lot of the information we collect, and you know, in one respect, we get folks who ask, why do they have to report their water use to the State Water Survey in Illinois? It's so that we can monitor things like this and help provide solutions. And we're working with a lot of communities. We have a lot of communities in Illinois that actually provide water level data to us regularly. And if you collect that data, there's certainly a resource agency in your state, or maybe your state geological survey, who would be grateful to have that information, because you can use it for things like this to help understand where there might be trouble. And we should do a new one of these. We haven't done one for quite a while, and really look at irrigation in the state, because that's expanded a fair amount. Typically, irrigation is in areas where there's a lot of water available, because they're sandy areas and they have a lot of infiltration, but not everywhere. And so we're starting to see new areas of concern because there's so much irrigation, and that can really affect water levels in an aquifer. So the other issue is, you know, I talked about chlorides, and so we'll start on the right. Those are chloride values in the deep aquifer. And as I mentioned before, further south, where that isn't considered an aquifer, that line is arbitrary based on some chloride value. But now we're starting to see chloride values migrate north, because as we pump water up by Chicago in the north part of the state, it's lowering the water level there. And so the higher water levels that are further south are starting to push water towards the north. And you can see that in this diagram, how low the chlorides are in most of the wells in the far north part of the state. But as you move to the southern part here, we're starting to see chloride values jump up over the secondary health standard of 250, which means you start to have some taste issues. And it's going to keep going up. The middle picture is the sand and gravel aquifers in Illinois, and that's the blue there. I guess the issue here is that shallow aquifers can be affected by road salt, for one, and other things, and also lowering water levels in the shallow aquifers can induce flow upward from the deeper aquifers. But you can see it's kind of all over the map, and that's because, you know, there's a lot of different causes. Some of these aquifers are close to the surface, some are more buried. So if you look at the Mahomet there in the middle, that big thick part in the middle that goes across the state, a lot of those are really low. But we found an area about in the middle of that on the south side where you start to see some high chlorides, and we found there's some bedrock, high bedrock values of chloride that are sit right underneath the Mahomet. And now we're starting to see some Mahomet private wells start to show higher chlorides because it's upwelling from the bedrock. And that's just nature, and there's not a lot you can do but treat. And then the picture on the left, those are all rivers, and the major rivers in the state. And obviously those values are lower. If you look at the legend, the big circles are only 100. But a river shouldn't have 100 parts, 100 milligrams per liter of chloride. And so this is the effect of the urban area in Chicago, as well as a lot of other areas where we're using road salt too much. And over the last 10 years, that's become much more regulated, and a lot of alternatives are starting to be developed. And even, we've seen where salt piles that a community may have that used to be uncovered, now everybody's got them in buildings. This is why, because you're starting to see a lot higher chlorides in rivers. And when we get to a certain point, you're not going to have an ecosystem. You're not going to have fish or any kind of living material. And so it's a concern. Here's an example of some of the communities in the north part of the state where chlorides have caused issues. And this is going back to 1960 for at least for East Dundee. But these are chloride values in these wells, and you can see how some of them are really going up a lot. The Lake Marion Water Corporation has some groundwater wells, and we're seeing it's went from around 25 in 1980 to well over 100. And so this is we're causing this ourselves. And if you're in, especially in an urban area, you should be monitoring this stuff for your water supply if you're using it well. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about wateroperator.org. Hopefully that's where you found this webinar, but if not, you can find it another way. This is the website that we host, where the resources are everything's free. We list all the training in the country for every TA provider. It's a really unique and useful website. And so it's a clearinghouse of information. I have 4 staff. We do a lot of legwork trying to find and add value to information before we even present it to people who are looking for it. It's searchable. We have this interface we developed. We actually brought in 20 small systems in Illinois for a day, had them go through it with us and tell us what works and what doesn't, what was easy to use, what wasn't. And you can call us, you can email us, we can help you find resources, we can mail you information and print it for you. We can also get you in touch with a TA provider if you have issues that require more extensive help. And that's our job. And it's all funded through the US EPA, so it's all free to you. But we link to information from over 800 organizations, every state agency, USDA, AWA, Water Environment Federations. This is again for water and wastewater operators. Every the RCAP network, all the rural water associations, any other operator associations that are out there, their state affiliates, all those folks. We find any information they have that's free and publicly available, and we link to it. And we've added keywords so you can search it and find topics, and I'm going to show you how that works. So, and we even write summaries of each one. When we first started this in 2008, some people still had very slow internet connections, and maybe you still do, a few people. And trying to download a large document like from EPA may take hours. And nowadays we don't really hear that, but we made this so that you could search quickly to see if a document you were interested in was actually useful before you actually tried to download it and spent that time. So when you go to our website, first thing I'm going to show you is the event calendar. If you click on event calendar, this is an older image, but it shows all the webinars we did last year. We've changed this. I apologize. I meant to take this slide out. So you can go in and search by state, category, host, and there's one other thing, type, I guess. And so just for example, for this month, for February of 21, I clicked on state equals Illinois. If you're an operator trying to get your CEUs, you're going to try to find an organization in your state, whether you're still doing remote or not. So this is all the this is all of the training that's going on in the state of Illinois right now. And if you're not familiar with, on the 4th, JJC is Joliet Junior College. On the 22nd, BHC is Blackhawk College. So we list a lot of things, and on the 3rd, it lists Hawk. You know, a lot of people have Hawk equipment for their labs, or their use for doing some of their sampling and testing. Hawk goes all over the country and tests, and in most states there were CEUs, and you may not even realize that. And so these are the organizations in our state that actually do most of the training, and you can see them there. If I say live webinar online, these are the ones that are live online or webinar. These are the webinars that are being hosted. So if your organization, like mine, my university won't let me travel, at least through June. I couldn't go to any in-person classes yet. These are the things that are being offered as webinars and are worth CEUs in the state of Illinois. And you can do this for any state. When you click on Blackhawk College, it brings up this page. It's a pop-up. It tells you all the details, how to get back. This is Illinois. It's on ILRWA is Illinois Rural Water. It's on their page. They're doing this in cooperation with Blackhawk College. And this is a certification class for C&D in Illinois, so it's a lot of money. But it's certification prep. And so if you're trying to become an operator or trying to move from one class to another, you could do this to prepare. A lot of these are free trainings that are offered either through an RCAP affiliate, Illinois section, AWWA, or Illinois Rural Water, especially for small systems because of funding through US EPA. If you just say type equals webinar, I want to show this because, you know, April 2020 was a month in or half a month into the pandemic. And these are all the webinars in the entire country that were going on in April of 2020. So then in September of 2020, this is what that looked like. So now a lot of organizations have started using webinars. I'm not even through the first week, you know, I cut it off or whatever. And now this week today, this is the 25th, and these are all the trainings that are going on around the country. So it's a lot, right? It's a lot of information. And some of these, I know like Illinois section AWWA, the state of New Mexico now approves theirs. Why New Mexico? I have no idea, but I just noticed that on one last week. But these are all water and wastewater organizations that do training. You know, the 24th, Great Lakes RCAP, GLCAP, that training, I'm not sure what state it's in, but that's our home RCAP area here in Illinois too. They serve 11 states, I think. And so there's a ton of stuff here. So it's way too much to go through. If you scrolled over any of these, it would give you the details. The way we've set this up is if there's more than 3 on a day, it only gives you the acronym for the organization because otherwise it'd just be too busy. And so, but you can scroll over any of these and it'll tell you what the topic is and that information. So if I then go back to and leave the live online webinar, but I go to the second search box and say category equals groundwater, now we've narrowed that down. These are still all over the country, but there just aren't that many available on groundwater, right? And so it shows you on the right where it says keyword, there's a blank box, and it says the filters we've used are webinar, live online, and category equal groundwater. So if I click on that Virginia Tech class, it pops up the details again and says, this is a live online class, here's how you register. You know, it's a short course, it's $60, it's with 1.8 credits in Virginia. So we put 13,000 or more events in our calendar every year. And that's, again, all 50 states. So no matter where you're at in the country, you can find all the training that's available here. Matter of fact, the state of Washington recently held a meeting with us and all the trainers in the state and said, you need to make sure your stuff's on our website because we're going to start sending our operators to our calendar. So if you're in the state of Washington, they want you, Department of Health wants you to use our website to find training. It's a lot easier for us to maintain it than for them to do it as well, since we're funded to do that. You can also use the keyword search. So all the webinars that are live and online, I typed in COVID, and you can see this is what's going on this month. You know, I can click on next to see next month, or I can click on view list to see everything in our database, which may go out several months into the future that are on COVID or have a COVID at least, you know, like The Water Environment Association 93rd meeting on the 9th, their annual meeting has a lot of topics, so most of them would come up. It means there's at least one talk just about COVID at that event for wastewater operators. And you can, so someone asked, one of the questions today was about PFAS chemicals. There's a lot of training and information out there today about PFAS. You know, some states have already decided to regulate it on their own. You know, some states don't even have the authority to create their own regulation. And so they can't unless their legislature changes the rules. And so they're waiting on EPA to come out with whatever. But if you want to learn about PFAS and what issues it might be, there's a lot of training around the country. And you know, many of these you can sign up for. Maybe you won't get credit for it, or you have to go talk to your primacy agency in advance and find out if they'll accept it for credit. So you have to be proactive on your own. But a lot of these would be worthwhile for you if you're really trying to learn and prepare your community for, you know, some inevitable thing. The other, if you click on Resource Library, it comes up with this page, or you can scroll over it and there's a drop down that shows these things. But the other side of this is a document search. It works similarly, where you have a select button and you can pick category or host or state. Most of the time you're looking for a document on a topic, right? So you're going to look, you're going to pick category, which I'll describe next. So there's 4 ways to search. Type is broken down to all these things. If you're really into watching videos instead of reading, you can go to videos. Each state's, there are also tribes, and we do have some Canadian stuff in there just because even though we're funded by US EPA, some materials developed by some of the provinces or some of the organizations. You know, there's like the BC Waterworks Association is an affiliate of American Waterworks Association. Their materials are useful for all of us, not just Canadians. And so we try to provide that information. And then again, if you look at host, you can look at an individual host, which would be like Great Lakes RCAP or Illinois Section AWWA or, you know, RCAC on the West Coast. And so you can search for just their stuff, and you can go to their webpage and find that as well. But the advantage here is you're finding a lot more information. So there's 32 categories. 7 are strictly wastewater related. A number of them are strictly water related. And then there's a number that are both, you know, certification, financial stuff, all that. So, you know, asset management, backflow, water security, emergency response. So you can select any one of these as a search criteria. And so what I'm going to do is go through a few quick examples. If I select arsenic, it shows there's 187 results. So you can see what we've done here is you can click on the title and it'll take you to the document. You can read a summary first and scroll through more of these. And it also tells you who the host is and whose document it is. They're not ours. We don't own them. We don't host them. We link to them on other people's web pages. And that's so that you understand who has resources in your state as well. So if I decide to say iron, you know, in Illinois, we have a lot of iron in our groundwater. Most states do, I'm sure. But we know that arsenic co-precipitates with iron. So if you're removing iron, you're likely removing some arsenic if you have any in your water to start with. And so if I'm trying to find a document about how to remove arsenic by removing iron, I can search through this list. If I go to the 8th one here, it says exactly what I was looking for, arsenic removal during iron removal. It's a talk by the US EPA, and it discusses how to remove arsenic with iron. So going through that, it's a talk by Darren Lytle, who's one of the foremost experts in the country on arsenic at ORD, which is the Office of Research and Development. And they go through an example for a facility in Michigan. This is the setup. They want to remove iron, arsenic, and manganese. And so their wells are off to the left, and they oxidize, they have a contact basin, and they filter, right? So this is their system. If they put chlorine in at the end, they're getting 50% arsenic removal. If they move it before the pressure filters, they're still seeing 50% arsenic removal. But if they start the chlorine before it gets into the treatment plant, using the same amount of chlorine, same rate, everything, now they're seeing 75% removal. So just by where they put chlorine in the treatment train, they've optimized where they can, how much arsenic they can remove, which is a great thing if you're trying to avoid adding new treatment that's really expensive. So there's things like that. I'm not going to go through any more examples for time. I do want to mention that we've developed a class on groundwater and wells. That's for public water supplies. And we actually built it at the request of the EPA for non-community systems, because we also have a private well program where we've developed 10 lessons for private well owners, and many non-community systems are very much like a larger private well, right? But we've modified that at the request of some of the states to make it available for community water operators as well. And so you click on that link and it takes you to this page, and it's just a class. If you scroll down to the bottom, you're gonna see this. You need to look at it. Some states approve it for 2 hours of credit, some states only 1, and some states won't approve it at all. So you need to see if your state's on the list, if you're gonna take this to get credit for it. And this isn't what we're doing today. This is a self-paced training class that you have to take a quiz at after each of the 6 lessons and pass 70% in order to get credit for it. Then you can print out a certificate. We get information on it too, and depending on what your state rules are, we work with that state then to make sure you get your CEUs. And this is it. You know, it's going through the basics of groundwater, well contamination, how systems work, and best practices. And so as you go through this, it explains, there's videos, and when you're done, after you've been through the chapter 6, it tells you that you've done what your score is. I got 100%. Yay. I wrote it, I should have. And then you have a dashboard. This is the only class we have. You know, we're not in the business of trying to compete with all the other trainers. We want to support them. And so right now we don't have any other classes. If we add any, it would be related to the groundwater work that we do. And that's not necessarily in the cards right now. We have a newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks. And it's really useful is all I can say. What you can do is go to our website, and there's a newsletter tab. Take a look at a few of our newsletters. They have relative information relevant to what's going on today. Also, documents that we find that we think are useful, videos that we find that we think are useful, the things you can show you or your staff. What did I do? I guess that's the end. Let me go back. I apologize. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend you go take a look. And I can show that at the very end when we get to that. But
hey, Steve?
Yes.
I just wanted to point out that the short code for our newsletter actually doesn't work any longer. But you can go to our website at wateroperator.org and click on any of the buttons to get the newsletter.
I did not know that. I would have taken it off of here. Yeah, I put this on here a couple years ago because my staff had this set up, and I had, you know, I'm an older guy that doesn't necessarily subscribe to things by text, so I will make sure that gets changed. But I'll show you at the end. That's what we'll do. So Jennifer's taking your questions. So if you've asked any questions today in the question box, or if you have one now, you can type it in the question box. There's a few questions that we got in advance that we're going to answer, and then we'll take those at the very end. And so, yeah, I guess I didn't realize it was that short. It looks like right now we don't have any additional questions. So, so someone asked a question: how do you remove contaminants like PFOA and PFOS if it got into a groundwater well? You know, there's a lot of evolving work going on with, you know, there's hundreds of these PFAS chemicals, right? And so what EPA has out now are best practices, and a lot of, you know, some of the engineering firms are doing talks at either, you know, a rural water meeting or an AWA section meeting. But these are the 4 methods that actually work. And you can look into those, or maybe you're using one of those already. But if you're concerned about it, I am not a PFAS expert, and but I can help find more resources for you, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But it's really granular activated carbon, powdered activated carbon, ion exchange, or nanofiltration, or RO. And, you know, ion exchange is fairly common. You know, some of those things are fairly expensive to add if you don't already have that sort of treatment in place. If you do, good for you. But there's more work being done. EPA is researching, you know, the more common ones are the ones that there's stuff out about now. But, you know, PFAS are such a wide range of chemicals that we expect other types of PFAS compounds may have other types of treatment needs down the road, and it's just too early. They don't have all those answers yet. Are there any restrictions to application of chemicals or fertilizers around a well? So this is an important consideration for anyone with a well, right? For sure. But you need to discuss this with your state and your primacy agency. In Illinois, that's the Illinois EPA. And we've developed a law that allows any county or municipality to create their own setback zone based on a number of factors. They even have, there's a page I'm going to show you, but they have a workbook that a community can use to understand how you want to develop your ordinance, understanding what the lateral distance should be, and it's based on the geology, an aquifer test, and the radius of influence, which, that first diagram I showed with the cone of depression, that radius of influence is kind of a measure of that. How far away are you getting water from when your pump's turned on in your well? And that's how far you need to go. And if you can show that that's pretty far, then you need to, there's limits based on the state law. You have to get a variance and some other things. But this is the page on IEPA's webpage, and it talks about you can set up restrictions up to 1,000 feet. You may have, it depends on your type of well, how deep you're getting water from, all those things about how vulnerable your well might be, but that's probably a good idea regardless. As your well gets older, you see corrosion and steel pipe and some of those things. Further down the page, it talks about the maximum setback zone, how to apply for that. And these are the things that you need to know. Again, there's a workbook that you can use that'll walk you through this. But you need to have a lot of details about your well and understand what your radius of influence actually is and what your aquifer test shows to do that. So chemical treatment options, this is a question that we could just take hours and upon hours to answer. What are typical treatment options for arsenic, rad, selenium, fluoride, other things? We have a lot of resources available for that. I showed you one example. There's also the EPA treatability database. And if you just Google drinking water treatability database, maybe add in US EPA, you'll get to this page where you can click on find contaminant, type in your contaminant, and it's going to talk about the treatment options available for that. It's something the EPA maintains. It's free to anyone to use, and it's pretty useful. But if you go to our website again, and before we did arsenic as an example, but if you type in removal in the keyword filter, now it narrows it down from 187 to 60. And as you scroll through this list, on the second page, you can see here arsenic removal by ion exchange, arsenic removal by zero valent iron. There's a whole bunch of different ones, including the one that we clicked on, number 13, on arsenic removal technologies. But there's also a book from EPA called Arsenic Treatment Technology Evaluation Handbook for Small Systems, which you click on that, and it's a 151-page book that describes in detail all the different treatment. So if you really want to learn about it and understand it, and which things might be best for you, it goes through which things are more expensive, which things are more labor intensive, all those details. Or you can go back and say, trying this another way, instead of having arsenic as a category, put water treatment as a category, and then say arsenic, and you get 102 records. If I just want a quick and dirty description of how I might be able to treat that, then I can go in and add a second filter of fact sheet case studies. And now it narrowed it down to 29. And so these are going to be case studies or fact sheets. I'm looking for a fact sheet. And number 6 at the very bottom, arsenic removal and disposal for public water systems. This is from New Hampshire's Department of Environmental Services, and it's a 3-page fact sheet. So on the first page, it starts talking about, the first one is absorption treatment. The next page goes into oxidation and filtration of green sand, ion exchange, and there's more on the third page. But it's a short, quick, vetted by a state agency description of some of the things that are considerations, including the solid residuals you're going to have to deal with. So that's what I have today. And it looks like we don't have any questions from anyone. I realize we're at 2:30. Dick Meiliger is here from Municipal Well and Pump. And Dick, thanks for showing up. I don't know if you have anything you want to add or any comments you'd like to make. Feel free.
Yeah, the only input I might have is on the PFAS. We're all learning together. I was speaking with a gentleman in the water treatment industry at the Iowa Rural Show this week, and from a cost standpoint, treating the water for PFAS can be very expensive, and he figures that some of the municipalities might be looking to a deeper well rather than treating the water, and of course it all depends on the numbers, but and it all depends on where you are in the state. So I just thought that was pretty scary and also pretty interesting.
Great. So we do have a question. Thank you, Dick. Do you think it's reasonable to have chemical injection for a public water supply on a water main in a manhole? Oh, I think that's certainly out of my realm of expertise. Is this really, yeah, it's really not about, I mean, this is a system, this you're talking about in the distribution system. And I certainly wouldn't want to answer that. I can actually, if you'll email us, I will talk to someone who will have an answer for that, and I can get you, Dick, if you have any comments there, you probably don't work much on distribution systems. So
I think we can guess that the answer will be no, though.
yeah. Yeah, that's for sure, because it's too accessible, I assume. Okay, well, thanks everyone. And Dick, thanks for coming. I guess I apologize that we haven't had more questions.
No problem.
Sometimes, but I will be in touch with you. So thank you, everybody. And I'm gonna, when I shut off the webinar, it kills it for everyone. And so if you have anything else that comes up, you can email us at info@wateroperator.org. And you can go to our website, wateroperator.org, and get to all the information I showed you today. Okay, take care.